This is The Process on WCRX 88.1 FM and WCRX-FM.com. I'm Justin Baczek. My guest has been voted the best comic in Chicago by Chicago Reader magazine. He does his own one-man show, Never Been to Paris, and created and hosts the Blackout Diaries. I'm here with Sean Flannery. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, to set the stage here, you're not actually from Chicago, correct?
That's correct. I'm from Cleveland originally, and I moved to Chicago in 2000.
All right. So you tell me what got you started with your career in comedy and what brought you here eventually?
Sure. I always liked making people laugh with my friends and so on. And then my friends, when we all reached college, I'm from Cleveland, and they got scattered across the U.S., and I started writing them. This is kind of in the days before everyone embraced email. So I started writing them letters and mailing them to them and just telling them, updating them what was going on in my life. There was a lot of drinking stories in it. And they laughed at it, and they passed it around, at their fraternities and so on. And then strangers were asking me to write them and tell them what I was doing. So I sort of realized that was the first time I realized I can make strangers laugh, not just my friends. And I thought, well, it might be kind of cool to try stand-up comedy. So I had a day job that I moved to Chicago with, and I just started going to open mics to see what it was like. And I had a blast with it and haven't stopped.
All right, so how long was that? When did you get into open
I got
mics?
into stand-up comedy in about 2002, so
Okay,
I've been doing it for over 10 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
So every Saturday night you host what you call the Blackout Diaries, and you created that too. Could you give me a rundown on what that is exactly?
Yes, that is a show at the Subterranean that is every Saturday at 8 p.m., and what it is it's stand-up comics plus everyday Chicagoans telling true drinking stories. So we might have cops and firefighters talking about times they went out and they had too many, and we have photos from the events if the people have photos. So people go up, they just tell kind of a funny drinking story, show some photos from it, and then the audience can ask them questions like, were you arrested? How'd you ever get out of, Iowa, and so on. And it's usually a pretty funny show, and not only do you hear hilarious stories, you get to hear stories from, we had a postal service worker a couple weeks ago. You a lot of times you just hear people that have interesting jobs in your neighborhood, and you can ask them questions about that as well.
Right. Do you have an example of one of the stories that you'd like to share?
Sure. Well, the postal worker, he had a really funny story, not to only use his story, but he was on the island of Malta, which I was not familiar with, which is a small island in the Mediterranean. And he got really drunk, and he tried to go out with, he didn't realize that this lady was a prostitute, and her pimp tried to beat him up, and I guess he beat the pimp in a fight, and the Malta mob hired him. And he wakes up the next day, and technically he works for the Malta mob, and he has no recollection of any of this. And he comes to find it by photos in his cell phone. Oh my God, we got to leave Malta right now because the mob thinks I work for them. And it's just stories like that. I think everyone has a kind of amazing story, and sometimes they're not even drinking stories. We've had people come in. It's just the kind of stories that you love hearing, maybe at a bar or something like that. Just crazy stories that are really interesting and that you have 1,000 questions on.
So judging by that, you could say you frequent bars, right?
Yeah, I do. And a lot of times and I love to hear stories at bars. And a lot of times somebody will tell me an amazing story. And I'm like, oh, I do this show where people tell drinking stories, and I would love to have you. And you'd be surprised. Everyone is intimidated by stand-up comedy, and nobody wants to do that. But you'd be surprised how many people are willing to tell a drinking story on stage. I don't know, maybe it's because they've been telling it their whole life, and there's this weird mixture of pride and shame that you have in a drinking story that people like sharing that kind of experience. So, yeah, I run into a lot of people. In my line of work, you don't get off work till midnight, and, I'll go out for a beer, and, you just meet the most interesting people, and, you say, hey, come by Saturday and tell this story.
All right. What's your favorite drinking story that happened to you in particular?
That happened to me in particular? Okay, I'm going to give the fast version of this because it was a heck of a night. But my favorite band of all time is Huey Lewis and the News. And when in the late 1990s, his career wasn't doing too well, and he did a pharmacy convention in Cleveland, Ohio. And long story short, I was able to sneak in by buying the credentials off a pharmacist who didn't want to go. So I went as Ed Mitzen. I go there, I end up getting so drunk that I walk off a building, but everyone thinks Ed Mitzen has just walked off a building. So when they get to me, I'm like, I yell. I was worried I was going to die, and I didn't want them to call Ed's wife. Like, Ed just died. So I said, listen, nobody talked to my wife, and just left. And I always wondered what work was like on Monday for Ed Mitson when he got back to New Jersey and everyone thought he walked off a building.
He had to explain he didn't even go to the thing.
Yeah.
So, you're listening to The Process on WCRX 88.1 FM. I'm Justin Baczek. My guest is comedian Sean Flannery. We're talking about his show at the Subterranean, the Blackout Diaries, that he does every week there. It is every week?
It is every Saturday night, yeah. And then the other one, which you mentioned, which I appreciate, is Never Been to Paris, which is every Thursday at the Comedy Bar. And that's my one-man show, Never Been to Paris.
Could you give a rundown on what that is about?
Yes, that is about the last 10 times I nearly killed myself by accident. Also with photos from the events. This interview is making me sound like a maniac. A lot of these stories happened when I was younger. But that has stories like, a lot of those are just not paying attention. Like me and my brothers, when we were growing up, we would lick 9-volt batteries. I don't know if you've ever licked a 9-volt. You get like a silly little, they don't have 9 volts as often as they used to, but you get a silly little charge.
Right.
And I was interviewing an electronic repair store, and I assumed this unmarked battery was a 9-volt, but it was a 45-volt garage door opener battery.
Wow.
And I electrocuted myself unconscious in a job interview, licking it. So it's stories like that, just silly, like, oh my God, what was I thinking when I did that? I'm lucky to be here type stories.
Yeah, there's another story. I caught it on YouTube from one of your shows. It was about flinging someone out a window.
Wait, what was that? Oh, somebody going out a window?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That I didn't even know that was online. That was my brother. My dad was a social worker, so we had a 2-bedroom house, and me and my brothers were up in the attic.
Right.
And we have 4 beds. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. And we would put the beds together, and we would just wrestle all day long. And I had the kind of dad, I don't know if you have a dad like this or any of the listeners out there have a dad like this. Like, he couldn't watch his own kids. Like, he would just lose one of us. And, like, any time my mom had to go do something, a neighbor's mom would come watch us while my dad's in the house. And we haven't seen my dad in hours, and he just decides he's going to join this wrestling match we have going on. And he comes in through the door in the air at like 50 miles an hour, nails the beds. The force of that propels Kevin up to the window, and we're like, oh my God. And time like slows down as a body goes towards a window, and you start thinking, like, what floor are we on? 3rd, not good. Is that window open? It is. And we get down there, and luckily we drove this enormous 40 Econoline van. We get down there. My brother Kevin was on top of the van with a screen window around his torso yelling, let's do that again. And I'll never forget my dad's response, which summarizes my dad in so many levels. He looks at us and he like really mulls it over for a second. He goes, I don't know, guys. I don't want to dent the roof of that van. Like, that's the only reason he didn't want us jumping out the window, is he thought it would affect his resale value of the van.
I love that story. So there is, you do have the photos and the artwork with
Yes.
the show.
Yeah,
Never
that's a
Been to
good
Paris,
point. Yeah,
too.
I animate a lot of it, and some of it I draw, like, for things like that story, like I might draw Kevin going out the window and so on and being on top of the van. I like mixing media into comedy because I feel when you tell a story in real life, you're often showing photos to people, especially nowadays on your cell phone. You have all your photos
Right.
on you. So I like bringing that to the stage as well and mixing in photos with the narrative. I feel it's a more natural way to hear a story.
Okay. And my final question, when you moved to Chicago being new and especially being in the younger bar scene and stuff, did
Yeah.
you ever do any kind of faux pas culturally that Chicagoans don't like?
Well, I did a lot of drinking faux pas that your bartender won't like. Like going up and going, what's the cheapest beer you have here? Like opening question, you learn to be more diplomatic with those kind of things. The big faux pas that it doesn't, I love Chicago, and I've had offers to move to LA and New York, and I will never do it because I love this city so much. And I have 3 kids here, and I just love raising them here. But there is one thing I will never agree with Chicagoans with, which is that you can't put mustard on a hot dog.
Even ketchup.
Or ketchup, excuse me. And they freak out so bad about that. So, like, that would probably be the closest thing to a faux pas I have in terms of the Chicago world.
All right. Thank you to my guest, Sean Flannery. You can catch the Blackout Diaries at the Subterranean every Saturday night and Never Been to Paris at the Comedy Bar every Tuesday night.
Every
correct?
Thursday. Every Thursday at 8 p.m. Yeah. Oh, no, that's no problem at all.
I am Justin Baczek. Thank you for listening. This is The Process on WCRX-FM.com and, of course, 88.1 WCRX-FM.